I'd like to welcome you to the first installment of our Maryland Good Agricultural Practices series. And in this series, we're going to break down key components of a voluntary produce safety certification program, the Harmonized GAP Audit Standard. And we're going to discuss how to approach some different requirements about this standard in a way that makes sense to people on their farms and hopefully we make them a little bit more achievable. This series is brought to you by the Maryland Food Safety Network, and we are a group of produce safety specialists, University of Maryland Extension, the Agricultural Law Education Initiative, and the Maryland Department of Agriculture. My name is Angela Farelli. I'm an agent associate at the University of Maryland, and I will be your host today. For our first installment, I have the pleasure of introducing Molly Gillingham from the Maryland Department of Agriculture. Molly's been with the Food Quality Assurance Program at MDA for about 9 years, and in that time, her focus has been good agricultural practices, or GAPs, produce safety, organic certification, and egg inspections. Today, she'll be introducing us to Harmonized GAP, so by the end of this presentation, we hope to give you some helpful information about the basics of this type of audit, how you can use your current food safety plan to prep for this type of audit, what you need to add, and how to avoid some common mistakes. So with that, Molly, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Angela. Good morning. So like Angela said, we're going to go over the Harmonized GAP, basically the purpose of the audit, things you may need to add to your food safety plan to prepare you for the audit, how to request an audit, and then we'll end up with some of the common issues we've seen over the past couple years. So this is just a statement. So the funding for this workshop was made possible, Angela said, by the Maryland Department of Agricultural Specialty Crop Block Grant. So the purpose of a Harmonized GAP or Harmonized GAP Plus audit, the audit was developed as part of the Produce GAP Harmonization Initiative to develop a more uniform food safety audit standards for fresh fruits and vegetable producers. A couple of years ago, the Harmonized GAP audit was updated so that it aligns more with the requirements of the produce safety rule. And then most recently in 2018, USDA developed the Harmonized GAP Plus standards to create an equivalence to the GFSI requirements. And then, of course, many of our producers are requesting the Harmonized GAP audit as part of market access because their buyers are requiring them to have these audits done. So as far as preparing for an HGAP audit, the Maryland GAP is a good stepping stone for operations who are trying to build their way up to getting a USDA GAP audit. If you have the Maryland GAP audit already, you have a food safety plan in place. The plan may just need to be updated in order to meet the requirements of the HGAP audit. So you may need to have some written procedures in place or records or assessments that meet certain requirements of the Harmonized GAP audit. The Harmonized GAP audit is broken up into 3 sections. There's general questions, and then there's field operation and harvest, and then there's post-harvest operations. When you're requesting the audit, you can choose whether you want to have the field operations section done or the post-harvest. Most of the operations we deal with do both field harvest and post-harvest. But if your operation is just harvesting produce and you may be sending it directly to a buyer and you're not holding or storing any produce on your farm, then you may just be requesting the field harvest operations section. But if you're like a warehouse where you buy produce from different farms, then you may just be requesting the post-harvest section of the audit. I have 2 links below. The first link is for the actual standards of the harmonized audit. So if you click on that, you can see each requirement of the audit, what the auditor is looking for, and then ways the operation can comply with that specific requirement. And then the second link is just the checklist that we use during the audit. So you can use that to go over and see all the requirements that we'll be looking for when we come out to your operation. So now I'm going to go over all the differences between a Maryland GAP audit and the Harmonized GAP audit. So the first section is, we're going to go over some of the general questions that are different from the Maryland GAP. So the first one is management responsibility. So under G1, the Harmonized GAP is looking for a actual written procedure that identifies who in the operation is responsible for food safety activities, and then what happens when they're not available. So having that in your plan is something that the auditor is looking for. The next one is the food safety plan must have a disciplinary policy for food safety violations, and then you need to document the corrective actions when the policies are violated. The next section of the general questions is the food safety plan or risk assessment. So your food safety plan shall be reviewed annually, and then there must be a documentation whenever it's reviewed or updated that you have on file for the auditor to look at when they come out to the operation. And then this requirement, the operation has an approved supplier program for all incoming materials, including packaging. This requirement only applies to if you're getting the post-harvest section of the audit. Operations must keep a current record of all their approved suppliers for raw materials like bins, packaging materials, and then procedures must be available on accepting materials from suppliers who are not on the list or approving new suppliers to add to the list. So the next section we have is sampling or testing. Whenever you're testing, they want a written procedure that outlines your testing frequency, testing procedures, and then any actions to be taken based on the test results that you've received. And then next we have traceability. So the operation needs to create a written procedure for a traceability program and then keep records to accurately trace product one step forward and one step backwards. A trace back and trace forward exercise is required annually as part of the Harmonized GAP program, and records must be kept to document that this was conducted. Next is the recall program. So operation needs to have written procedures for their recall program and then to keep documents to show that a mock recall was performed annually. So you'll see that I have these WPs R and A in bold. So these are the type of documents that the auditor is looking for when we come out to the operation. So if you see WP, that means we're looking for a written procedure. If you see an R, that means there needs to be a record accompanying that section to show verification that it's actually being done. And then A is an assessment that we're looking for that was completed. So next we have corrective actions. The operation needs to establish written procedures for detailing corrective actions. And then again, records must be kept to show evidence of compliance, that you're recording these corrective actions and what was done. And then G9 is self-audits. So the operation needs to create an internal audit procedure and conduct a self-audit annually. They need to have a record to show that the audit was performed and then the results of the audit. So there's a few things in the worker health and hygiene section. I just wanted to point out that sometimes we see during the harmonized audit that people aren't quite mentioning. So a lot of you guys are making your employees aware of your health and hygiene practices. But this also applies to any contractors. So if you're hiring someone to come clean your porta potties, any visitors, any buyers coming onto the farm, or an auditor who comes onto your operation, they all need to be made aware of your food safety policies, health and hygiene policies. The next one is talking about adequate toilet facilities. So this is an OSHA requirement. So we're looking at the number of toilet facilities per employee, as well as their distance to the employees in their working location. So it needs to be about a 1/4 mile or a 5-minute walk. And then the next couple, we need to make sure your operation has policies to address clothing conditions, gloves, protective clothing, and hair covering if you're using these on your operation. So making sure your food safety plan addresses these. The next section we have is waste management. Make sure your operation develops a waste management plan, how waste and trash is stored, handled, and disposed of on the operation. So that's it for the general question differences. Now we're going to move ahead to the field harvest and operations section. So that F means field harvest and operation. So we're going to look at agricultural chemicals. So they need to be disposed of in a way not to be a source of contaminations. The main difference is that you need to keep a record of this, showing that you're disposing of them correctly. And then next we have the water system distribution. So water system description shall be available for review. So this is a written procedure for your water system, a description of your water sources, their location, you have any permanent fixtures, your flow of water, things like that. Next is animal control. So this is one where they're looking for an assessment. So you need to have a written assessment of your growing areas, any adjacent land prior to the growing season that addresses any risk from wild and domestic animal activity. Next, we'll move on to the soil amendments. Again, this one's looking for an assessment as well. So if you're using any animal-based soil amendments, you need to have a written assessment that needs to address the risk, preparation, use, and storage of the soil amendment. And then again, they need a record to accompany that to show that you're in compliance. So this one, I combined the field harvest and the post-harvest section for the vehicle, equipment, tools, and utensils. So the first one talks about all your equipment on the farm needs to be identified. So operation needs to have a record or a list of all equipment, tools, vehicles that they have on the operation that may contact produce. The next one is a written procedure that addresses any spills, leaks from these equipment that may be a potential source of any chemical hazard, and how this procedure would include how you would take care of the spill. The next one talks about water tanks. So the operation needs to have a written procedure on how they are cleaning their water tanks. And then if you are using any foreign material control devices, then you need to keep record of the maintenance and calibration of these tools. And again, you need a record for that. The next section is pre-harvest assessment. A pre-harvest risk assessment must be performed that evaluates the conditions that may likely cause contamination. And then of course, this is done pre-harvest. So next we're going to look at containers, bins, and packaging material. So the operation needs to have a written procedure that describes the type of harvesting containers used and packing material that will be used on the operation and whether they're acceptable for their job. The next one talks about whether product contact containers can be permitted directly in the ground. For this, we're looking for a written procedure that is created regarding the placement of product contact containers and whether they're permitted on the ground or if you're doing some type of buffer between the containers. It just needs to be outlined in that written procedure. And then the next one talks about inspection of food contact containers. So again, we're looking for another written procedure on how the operation is inspecting these food contact containers before they're being used. So now we're going to move on to field packing and handling. So with these, we're looking for written procedures. The employees are trained on dealing with any damaged, decaying, and dropped produce, and then there needs to be evidence of training to accompany that written procedure. The last one, so it talks about cloth, towels, or any other cleaning materials. So these shall not be used but if you are, operation needs to create a procedure to prevent any cross-contamination between products. So now that we're switching over to the P, so post-harvest section, first section is facility. So if your operation has any allergen on site, your operation must assess the risk and have written procedures on how you're controlling that. Next is maintenance and sanitation. So we're looking for procedures on how the operation is addressing any temporary repairs and the timeline you're giving for these repairs. And then storage, all chemicals shall be stored in a secure location. So we're looking for something that's locked, kept away from any other materials or supplies, and then that they should be properly labeled. Next, we have transportation. So if you're using refrigerated transport vehicles, you need to have a written procedure on how these equipments are being controlled. The temperature of these equipment is being controlled, whether by a device in the trucks. And then finally, the operation shall have written procedures on verifying the cleanliness and functionalities of these shipping units. So those are the main differences between a Maryland GAP and a Harmonized GAP audit. There are some more differences for the Harmonized GAP Plus. I didn't list them all out for you, but if I'll go over these links that'll tell you where to look for information if you want to go that route. But the Harmonized GAP Plus audit was created to be equivalent to the GFSI. They added requirements for risk identification, control and mitigation of these risks, and then monitoring, verification, and documentation. Some of the added requirements of this audit include food defense, food fraud. But if you're interested in the HGAP Plus audit, the first link again is the standards. That'll tell you each requirement, what the auditor is looking for, and ways that your operation can be in compliant. And then the second link is the checklist that the auditors are using. So once you think you're ready for the Harmonized GAP audit, the next step is to request an audit. So there needs to be 3 forms that are completed. The first one is the 237A. That's the actual request form that you fill out to say which part of the audit you want done, the crops you're growing, when you anticipate the audit needs to be done. The second one is the vendor form. So this is mainly for billing purposes. And then the last one is your participation agreement, meaning you agree to have the audit done on the farm. So if this is your first year doing the Harmonized GAP audit, you need to do all 3 of these forms. The vendor form and the participation form need to be done your first year. After that, you can just turn in the request form. The request form and the participation agreement form get sent to our office at MDA, but the vendor form actually needs to be turned into USDA. And then once you completed all these forms and turned them in, then one of the auditors will get in touch with you to schedule your Harmonized GAP audit. As far as billing for these audits, normally the fees are $115 an hour, but if you're requesting an Harmonized GAP or Harmonized GAP Plus audit, all audit fees are currently being reimbursed by the FSA Risk Management Agency, since Maryland is considered an agricultural management assistance state. So although all fees are being reimbursed, you will receive an invoice after the audit from USDA, but it will just show that you have a balance of 0. So when we come out to your farm to do your audit, and after you look over your food safety plan, evaluate your practices on the farm, one of 2 things will happen. You either A, pass the audit, which means you meet the minimum requirements of the standards. And then if during the audit, the auditor found any areas where your attention is needed, then a corrective action report may be issued to you where you just address how you will plan to fix the issue. Or B, you fail the audit, meaning you didn't meet the minimum requirements of the standards. Some items of the checklist are considered mandatory and must be marked as compliant in order for you to pass the audit. So if one of these questions was answered as a no, then the auditor will alert you to these issues that need immediate attention, but then the audit will be over at that point since you didn't meet that mandatory requirement. So we recommend that everyone should conduct one of those self-audits during the required annual review of your food safety plan. This is simply just going through the USDA harmonized checklist prior to the audit and of us coming out to your farms that you can prevent any of these automatic failures before we address them to you. During the self-audit, you'll be able to catch, like I said, all those mandatory audit points that may be missed. This is something you can do prior to the audit to ensure that you do not fail because of maybe like a missing signature, a date, a missing written procedure. Note we're going to have a later webinar that'll focus on some of these assessments that have been a common audit point miss throughout the years. Do we have any questions before we go on to some of the more common issues we've seen over the past couple of years?
Thanks so much, Molly, for that installment. Does anyone want to pop a question into the chat, or feel free to come off mute and ask Molly about the basics of an HGAP audit in Maryland? All right, barring none, we'll have time at the end for more questions. So go right on ahead, Molly. We can stick with our second installment here.
Sounds good. All right, so like I said, we're going to go over common audit points that were missed during 2020. So the first section, you'll notice a lot of these ones I'm going to point out are the differences between a Maryland GAP audit and a Harmonized GAP audit that I just pointed out at the beginning of this presentation. So the first one we see common is equipment, vehicles, tools, and other materials used on the farm that may contact produce are identified. So this is that list of equipment that I talked about. You're required to keep a current list of equipment that may contact produce. During the audit, we verified that there are no missing food contact surfaces on these lists. And then, so like if you use a wagon in a field and it's missing off the list, then it's not on the list, and then we have to deduct those points off of your audit. The next one is also under the equipment. It's just stating that any equipment that is used in farm operation which come in contact with produce is in good repair. So under this, we are observing the harvest to ensure that things match your equipment list. So in 2020, a number of our apple growers had identified bins as the food contact surfaces, and they were either missing the cleaning record to show that they were clean because they were being done by a third party person. So if you're contracting someone to do the cleaning of equipment, you need to get a record from them to show that that cleaning was done. So this one talks about instruments used to measure either temperature, pH, antimicrobial levels, that they are maintained and calibrated frequently. You notice a lot of operations didn't have calibration records of instruments used in dump tanks to measure the levels of antimicrobial or the temperature devices. Things that are not routinely monitored as specified in the food safety plan. So they may say in your plan that you're calibrating these equipment, but then you don't have a record to show that the calibration was done. So then we wouldn't be able to give you the points for this section. And then as you can see, this little dot right here means that it's a mandatory question. So if it was answered as no, then you wouldn't be able to pass the audit. So the next next one we've seen a lot of talks about the porta potties. It's great that you guys have these hand washing stations outside the porta potties, but there's nothing there to collect the trash after they use the hand washing station. Where do they put their paper towels after they're done using them? Again, another part is about these portable hand washing stations. There's nothing there to collect that wastewater from washing the hands. It could be a potential for contamination. So the next one, any cleaning agents that you're using on the operation need to be approved for their intended use of food contact surfaces. We're seeing some operations use materials for these cleanings, and then when we look on the label, they're not intended to be used on any food contact surfaces. So make sure to check those labels when you're purchasing these agents for cleaning. The next one is talking about if you're treating your water for the microbial levels. If you're treating the water, we notice a lot of the time they weren't monitoring the concentration. So if you're treating water because of an unknown or undesirable quality, it must be monitored to require the concentration level of whatever product you're using is being met. If you're not monitoring, then how are you knowing that your treatment is actually doing its job? Another common point is a farm in their food safety plan says they have no water tanks, but then when we go out to the fields, take a look, we actually see them using water tanks in their operation. So make sure to evaluate that. Do you actually have a water tank on hand? And if so, you need to have a written procedure on how you're taking care of it, cleaning those water tanks at a frequency as so that they're not a source of contamination. So the next one talks about equipment. Lots of time we see that the farmers, they don't have a checklist for the vehicles, cleanliness and functionality for produce that they're loading and sending out. This checklist is just made sure to ensure that the prior load doesn't affect what you're putting onto the trucks and not a potential source of contamination for the product. And then we're also noting during inspections that caps are missing off of wellheads, screws are missing. There's a lot of damage around the wellheads, there's overgrowth. Part of your assessment of the water is to ensure that the distribution system is not a hazard, and you should be checking these areas. If we find these deficiencies during the audit, then we're thinking, was an adequate risk assessment actually performed by the operation? Because if it wasn't, they probably would have noticed these deficiencies before we did. This was a video that just showed the effects of power washing surfaces. So they put some glow germ on the walls in the floor drain, and then we sprayed it with a power washer, and you can see that after spraying it, the germs actually got onto like some of the food contact surfaces. So when you're creating your cleaning schedule, your cleaning SOPs, consider your method of cleaning, and is it a potential source for actually contamination of other surfaces and products. And then so all this is done in a statewide collaboration where the center goal is to create resources and conduct research to help farmers reach their food safety goals in Maryland. That's all that I have. Do I have any questions about anything?
Thank you so much, Molly, for such a great, wonderful walkthrough and introduction to what the HGAP audit is. I think while people are noodling around their questions, thinking about what they want to ask, I do have the video up that that Molly referenced in that previous slide to take a look at, what happens when we are using our power washers in enclosed areas. So I'm going to try to get that up for you guys. It's a 1-minute video. All right, here we go. Hopefully it'll play. Woo! Okay. All right. So hopefully through that, you guys can, it's hopefully the germs from the glow germ that we used a UV reactive splatter compound to show just how much a power washer can throw things around if you're directing it into some areas in an enclosed space. So it's always a good idea to power wash outside if you can. If you can't, you can cover things that you're not power washing and plan to clean them later if you're power washing like the walls of a piece of equipment or something like that. And then, as you saw in the video there, power washing the drain is just never gonna, it's not gonna get you that clean that you want. It might kick up some extra dirt that you don't want. So, all right. So with that, I'll open up the floor for questions. Again, Molly, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation on introducing us to HGAP. Molly, I've got a question for you. So we just kind of gave everybody a good navigation of like how to get, how to get their mind around HGAP. So what would you say, how much time would you say a farm should budget to prepare for an HGAP audit? I guess like month wise.
Okay. So this is hard because it depends, because we've been to some, so if you have a Maryland GAP audit, I would say maybe a couple hours to go through the checklist to see what you're missing, but it depends on how well your food safety plan is put together. If it's pretty basic, then you may be looking at more time. But if it's pretty intense, it may just be an hour looking through there, what things you're missing, creating those written procedures, adding new records. I think it just depends on how well your food safety plan is written and how well food safety culture is at the operation. Like, yeah, I think it just depends. It's a hard question to answer timeline wise.
Yeah, certainly. I also had a question for our audience, for our audience. So you went through a couple of really good slides talking about the common audit points that people missed. Maybe if you can pull up one where we didn't have a record or anything associated, so it was a blank there. Can we just explain to people if there's no like record associated or written policy associated with the standard or assessment, what are people supposed to do for that sort of
So
piece?
if it's blank, we the auditors are either looking in your food safety plan to see if you address it somewhere, or if while we're on the farm, we observe that requirement out in the field. That'll satisfy that part of the requirement if it's just blank.
Okay, great. Thank you.